November 13th, 1942. 1:48 hours. Iron Bottom Sound. A searchlight ripped a white scar through the tropical dark as Captain Tameichi Hara clenched the bridge rail of the destroyer Amatsukaze. Around him the sea detonated, plumes of water and steel erupting in sickle-bright flashes. The log line he scribbled in that chaos. They are not aiming. They are simply filling the sky with metal. Caught more than the terror of a night action. It captured the shape of a war that would be decided by numbers long before many Japanese officers could admit it. Across the water, USS San Francisco poured fire at a tempo that bent belief. In the span of roughly 35 seconds, the American cruiser hurled more 5-inch shells than some Japanese destroyers carried for entire operations. The point wasn't precision, it was saturation. Gun barrels ran red. The darkness became a feverish noon. 2,700 miles away in Pearl Harbor, ammunition ships were already being packed for the next turn of the wheel. 15,000 tons of shells in one load, enough to replace what would be spent in this battle dozens of times over. In Tokyo, planners weighed whether they could allot 12 rounds per gun for a convoy run. Between those two ledgers, one indulgent, one austere, the outcome was being written in brass and cordite. Tameichi Hara would live to be a rare witness, a Japanese destroyer captain who fought from Pearl Harbor to the surrender. He watched not only ships break, but assumptions. The awakening had started months earlier, though its outlines were still faint. May 7, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Commander Teishi Naito, executive officer aboard the carrier Shokaku, saw a pattern that refused to leave his mind. American cruisers and destroyers kept their anti-aircraft batteries speaking for 4 continuous hours. No pauses, no husbanding of ammunition. Later, in captivity, he would tell interrogators that each American destroyer seemed to carry more AA rounds than an entire Japanese destroyer division. It sounded like hyperbole until one compared doctrine with reality. Japanese practice had been pared by scarcity into ritual. The Type 96 25mm, the standard light AA gun, was bound by firing rules. Hold fire until 800 meters, burst in 3s and 5s, stop the instant the target slipped from the narrow envelope of useful range. Not because that was the best way to kill a diving airplane, but because the magazines could support little else. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya aboard Ryujo drilled his crews to the minute. On paper, and in his memory, the ship carried enough AA ammunition for 12 minutes of continuous fire. After that, the sky would belong to the attacker. Opposite them, the Americans appeared to fire for hours as if the ocean itself were their powder magazine. The difference sharpened to a blade around Guadalcanal, where numbers became wounds. Yet the first hints had come earlier in the year. February 27, 1942, the Java Sea. The day belonged to the Imperial Navy tactically, but what Captain Hara of Amatsukaze saw left him uneasy. The combined American-British-Dutch-Australian force under Rear Admiral Karl Doorman blazed away. 1,019 rounds of 8-inch ammunition let loose, only 5 hits to show. 4 of them duds. Japanese ships used fewer shells and scored the strikes that mattered. Even so, Hara's after-action thoughts circled back to the same refrain. The Allied cruisers and destroyers did not stop firing. The rates would have vacuumed Japanese magazines dry in the opening hour. They fired as if they had unlimited shells. He would write in a memoir years later. Poor shooting, perhaps, but so much ammunition that accuracy ceded pride of place to volume. The victory roll was stark. 2 Allied cruisers and 3 destroyers sunk, but arithmetic intruded even in triumph. In the wardroom, Hara overheard his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Yoshida, working the ledger. 40% of their main battery ammunition expended. Another 2 hours of such fighting, and the magazines would be bare. Amatsukaze had sailed with 2,000 rounds of 5-inch. About 800 were gone in one battle. From survivors of the destroyed Allied cruiser HMS Exat, the Japanese learned she had fired over 1,500 rounds from her 8-inch guns alone, more than many Japanese heavy cruisers carried in total. Then came August. On the 7th, the Americans went ashore on Guadalcanal. 3 days later, the Imperial Navy struck back at Savo Island. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's force had rushed south from Rabaul with only enough ammunition for a single night's work. Not by tactical choice, but because that was all the magazines at Rabaul could supply. The result looked at first like vindication. In 33 minutes, 4 Allied heavy cruisers went down and 1,077 sailors with them. Japanese losses in ships were nil. Hidden inside that victory was the bill that would haunt the campaign. Commander Toshikazu Omi, Mikawa's operations officer, later told American interrogators the unvarnished reason for the swift withdrawal. It wasn't primarily fear of dawn air attack, as the Allies guessed. The magazines were thin. There was little left for a second engagement. They had fired 471 rounds to score 10 hits, a 2.1% rate that Tokyo would later scold as wasteful, even as it reflected the practical limits of night gunnery. And so the American transports, fat with supplies and largely undefended, were spared, not by luck, but because the Japanese could not afford to shoot at them again. Across the Pacific, the loading cranes at Pearl Harbor kept swinging. Captain William Poco Smith supervised the ammunition ship USS Rainier as she took aboard the cargo for a single voyage. 5,000 tons of naval ammunition, to include 350,000 rounds of 5-inch, 1.2 million rounds of 40mm, and 3 million rounds of 20mm. One ship, one trip. More than the combined fleet would fire in the next 3 months. The contrast took on a bleak intimacy in the Tokyo Express runs, high-speed destroyer dashes to feed Guadalcanal's starving garrison. On November 30th, 1942, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka led 8 destroyers on another nocturnal thread-the-needle. Captured paperwork later laid the cargo bare. Rice, 100 drums, medical supplies, 200 drums, ammunition, 280 drums, for 15,000 soldiers. Each drum meant roughly 300 rifle cartridges or an equivalent weight in other munitions. An entire garrison's lifeblood delivered a few barrels at a time, less ammunition than a single American destroyer might spend in 20 minutes of honest combat. From a Matsukaze, Hara wrote with bitter clarity, "They risked 8 destroyers and burned precious fuel to deliver what the Americans probably waste in target practice." He was closer to the truth than he knew. That same day, USS Fletcher conducted a routine gunnery exercise and burned 127 rounds of 5-inch, about half of one drum, from Tanaka's precious allotment. Thread these episodes together, and a single pattern emerges. Where Japanese doctrine narrowed the moment of fire to the perfect instant, because every round was precious, the Americans broadened it into a method. Build a wall of steel, keep it dense, and make the enemy fly or sail through it. The difference was not temperament, it was supply. By late 1942, the math was hardening. The waters off Guadalcanal would earn the name Iron Bottom Sound for the ships that sank there, but the label also fit the logic that ruled those nights. The campaign was becoming a duel between a navy that counted every round and another that could afford not to count at all. The next year would show why that divide kept widening. Vast depots rising on the prairie, assembly lines spinning out 5-inch rounds by the 100,000, and a logistics fleet that could refill magazines in the open ocean. Scarcity would carve Japanese tactics smaller and harder. Abundance would let American commanders redraw how naval fire itself was used. That story begins inland, far from the roar of guns, among rails, bunkers, and factories designed to make the sea burn like daylight. Chapter 2. Factories on the Prairie, Scarcity at Sea. The contrast that Guadalcanal revealed in sudden flashes of light would be forged day after day far from any shoreline. In early 1943, As exhausted destroyers traded torpedoes among jungle silhouettes, a new landscape of war bloomed across the American interior. Rails, bunkers, and powder houses stitched into the plains. Industrial geography was becoming strategy. In March 1943, the Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings, Nebraska, came alive on 48,000 acres of rolling prairie. 2,200 buildings, 207 miles of private track, and a workforce that would climb to 10,000 turned grassland into an armory. Hastings did not merely fill orders, it set the tempo. In its first month, the plant produced more naval ammunition than all Japanese facilities together would manage for the remainder of that year. Its specialty, 5-inch 38 caliber ammunition, the heartbeat of American naval gunnery, left the loading lines at a clip of 100,000 rounds per month initially, rising toward 300,000 by September. Each round was inspected and tested. More shells failed Hastings quality checks in a month than some Japanese factories produced, period. At the same moment, Naval Ammunition Depot McAllister in Oklahoma was opening its own labyrinth of magazines and assembly lines. Where Hastings focused on the Navy's versatile 5-inch staple, McAllister fed the heavy end of the fleet's diet, larger caliber shells and aerial bombs. By December 1943, monthly output included 16-inch, 14-inch, 8-inch, and 6-inch projectiles, tens of thousands of them, plus 500,000 pounds of aviation ordnance. By war's peak, 8,600 workers kept the lines moving. The system's strength lay not in one plant, but in the network. Multiple depots synchronized to feed the fleet without pause. Inside Japan, the arithmetic bent the other way. The Kure Naval Arsenal, the crown jewel, struggled to turn out 10,000 shells of all calibers in a month. Toyokawa, expanded at painful cost in 1940, managed impressive counts in small arms, 35,000 machine guns and 4.5 million rounds monthly, but at staggering human expense, 56,400 workers, including 6,000 conscripted schoolchildren, some just 12, performing hazardous tasks under relentless schedules. Where American inspectors rejected imperfect shells, Japanese managers fought shortages of copper, lead, and skilled labor while accident rates rose. This divergence seeped into tactics by necessity. On paper, Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine still preached discipline. Hold until 800 meters, fire in short, economical bursts, cease as soon as the target crossed the optimal angle. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya had drilled those habits into Ryujo's crews until they were second nature, because the ship's magazines permitted exactly 12 minutes of continuous fire. That limit was as real as armor thickness. In the American fleet, the same problem was attacked from the opposite direction. Drown probability with volume. If a single shell had a slim chance at a fast-moving, bad-angled target, then the answer was not to wait for perfection. It was to put so many shells in the sky that perfect became irrelevant. Off Guadalcanal, the result was audible. American destroyers and cruisers kept their AA batteries talking until aircraft either broke away or broke apart. Commander Teishi Naito's note from the Shokaku that an American destroyer seemed to carry more anti-aircraft ammunition than an entire Japanese destroyer division went from suspicion to certainty the longer the campaign wore on. The point was not bravado, it was logistics. For every minute an American captain spent firing, someone inland had already arranged the next train, the next ship, the next barge. The gun crews lived inside an assurance built by strangers. By late 1942, the Tokyo Express runs had already exposed the sheer thinness of Japanese resupply. November 30's mission under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka spelled it out with ruthless simplicity. 15,000 soldiers needed ammunition. The convoy carried only 280 drums of it. Each drum translated to roughly 300 rifle rounds, or the equivalent weight in other munitions. A single American destroyer could vaporize that stockpile in a sliver of a gunnery exercise. Hara, still driving a Matsukaze through those black corridors of water, felt the futility sharpen to a point, risking 8 destroyers to deliver what the enemy might spend before lunch. Beyond the front line, the American system kept adding capacity. Hastings grew into a city-state of war work. Dormitories filled, cafeterias served 15,000 meals a day. Recreation halls, bowling alleys, Friday night movies, amenities that sustained a labor force expected to deliver precision under pressure. Children attended schools built for the depot. Buses moved shift crews through the gates like clockwork. The place existed to transform ores and chemicals into shells with reliable fuses and uniform weights, ammunition that would feed fire control computers and radar-guided directors with the predictability they required. The Japanese industrial map showed a different story. Kure strained. Toyokawa expanded and then buckled. Copper shortages forced collection drives that reached into temples and homes. Bells cast centuries earlier were pried from beams and melted for casings. Bronze statues disappeared into foundries. The workforce skewed younger, more exhausted, and less trained as the war ground on. Accident rates climbed toward catastrophe. Output numbers that looked large in isolation. Tens of thousands of machine guns, millions of rounds, collapsed when measured against demand across an oceanic war. Meanwhile, the American fleet learned to fight like accountants with cannons. A destroyer's 5-inch battery became a metronome. If the solution demanded 15 rounds per minute from each mount to thicken the air, then 15 it would be. If a cruiser's turrets needed to keep the night bright for allies to maneuver, the order was simple: keep the flashes steady. The assumption beneath it all was that tomorrow's replenishment would arrive, and the day after that, and the day after that. Evidence of this calculus turned up even in routine reports. A stateside ammunition ship like USS Rainier could step off the pier with 5,000 tons aboard, 350,000 rounds of 5-inch, 1.2 million of 40mm, 3 million of 20mm in a single voyage. That cargo, by itself, exceeded what the combined fleet would expend over entire seasons. In the Java Sea, Allied gunnery had been wasteful in its effect, but its pace telegraphed what was coming. A navy that could afford to fire through uncertainty until the odds bent its way. By early 1943, the momentum behind those shells was no longer a secret to those who cared to count. Helena, San Francisco, New Jersey, and the rest did not fire carelessly. They fired to a doctrine born from abundance. Gun crews learned to create light, to turn night into data for radar and directors, to fill approach corridors with steel rather than chase a fleeting perfect lead. For Japanese officers like Hara, the lesson felt like a tightening knot. Doctrine honed over decades had been written for a world in which every navy faced the same constraints. Now the constraints were asymmetrical. One side planned operations around the last rounds in its lockers, the other scheduled trains. Industrial war is a slow pivot that looks, in the moment, like accidents and anecdotes. But by mid-1943, the pivot was clear. American depots were hitting their stride. Japanese arsenals were working children to keep furnaces lit. Training on one side burned tens of thousands of practice rounds. On the other, pilots counted the exact seconds their guns could fire before silence. The sea would record the difference in wrecks and rescues, but the decision point was already buried under warehouses and rail spurs. Soon, the sky itself would demonstrate what happens when proximity fuses, radar directors, and bottomless magazines meet an air arm that must husband every bullet. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would give that arithmetic a name, and then make it look like fate. Chapter 3. Skies of Steel, Oceans of Fire. By mid-1944, the Pacific no longer belonged to admirals, it belonged to factories. The naval duels that had once turned on weather and courage now turned on arithmetic. Shells per minute, barrels per month, and tons per day. In this new order, ammunition became destiny. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded Japan's last great carrier force, 9 carriers, 473 aircraft, and a faith that one more decisive battle might yet tilt the balance. Opposite him, Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet sailed with 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, nearly double Ozawa's numbers. But the true imbalance was invisible on the map. It lay in the magazines. Every American ship in Spruance's task force carried what Ozawa could not even imagine: virtually infinite ammunition. Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi, flying a Zero from the carrier Taiho, described the scene that met him as he dived on the enemy. The sky, he said, turned black with explosions. Not single, aimed shots, but a continuous wall of fire. The Americans were not targeting aircraft, they were shaping airspace. Each 5-inch mount pumped 15 rounds per minute. Every 40mm quadruple Bofors mount poured out 120 rounds per minute. The 20mm Oerlikons rattled off 450. The destroyer USS Stockholm alone hurled 12,000 rounds of 40 meters and 20,000 of 20-meter ammunition in 6 hours. Commander David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's top ace, later said it plainly. The Japs flew into a curtain of fire. Our ships weren't aiming at planes. They were creating zones of death that nothing could fly through. The results were mathematical. Japanese losses, 476 aircraft. American losses, 29. Ammunition expended, 200,000 rounds of 5-inch, 500,000 rounds of 40mm, and 1.2 million rounds of 20 mes. One Japanese pilot captured afterward said, "It was not battle, it was execution by machinery." The Pacific's airspace had become a factory output chart written in flak and tracer lines. 4 months later, that arithmetic would play out again, this time on the ocean's surface. October 25, 1944. Off Sama Island, the Battle of Leyte Gulf's most improbable fight unfolded. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, had stumbled upon Task Unit 77.4.3, Taffy 3, a group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The odds were absurd. Yet within the hour, American destroyers were charging battleships. Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston gave the order without hesitation. All engines ahead flank, left full rudder, prepare to attack major Japanese fleet units. The little destroyer spat more than 200 rounds from her 5 5-inch guns at the heavy cruiser Kumano, tearing her superstructure to pieces. Then she turned her guns on the battleship Congo, firing another 30 rounds while weaving through her own smoke. On USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland made his own impossible call. "We're going in, boys." Each of his guns carried 325 rounds, 1,625 in total. In 35 minutes, one mount alone fired over 600 rounds, almost 40% of the ship's entire stockpile. The gun barrels glowed white. When power failed, the crew kept loading by hand. Gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul H. Carr was found dying beside his mount, clutching the last 5-inch shell, trying to load it himself. Meanwhile, Japan's greatest battleship, Yamato, fired her massive 18.1-inch guns in surface combat for the first and only time. Dozens of shells, each weighing nearly a ton, screamed through the air, and most passed cleanly through their targets without detonating. They had been built for armor plate, not for thin-skinned escort carriers. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commanding Yamato's division, wrote that night, "The enemy destroyers charged through their own smoke, firing continuously. Such expenditure of ammunition for such small ships, it defies calculation." But calculation was exactly what decided the battle. American ships fired roughly 20,000 rounds of all calibers. The Japanese, only 3,000. The results: 3 Japanese heavy cruisers crippled. Kurita's force withdrew. The equation was brutal and inescapable. Volume could replace size. Endless ammunition could turn escort carriers into predators and destroyers into war gods. Behind those figures lay an industrial machine that no naval courage could match. By late 1944, the United States was producing ammunition on a planetary scale. 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition by war's end. Enough, as one general noted, for 10 shots at every person alive on Earth. In November 1944 alone, U.S. factories turned out 3.5 billion small arms rounds, 1.2 million 5-inch shells, 8 million 40mm rounds, 20 million 20mm rounds. Even the giant 16-inch shells, 10,000 of them, rolled off assembly lines that month. Japan, by comparison, produced roughly 15 million rounds of all types during the entire war. The numbers had become so large that they no longer described weapons. They described civilization. At Indiana's Crane Naval Ammunition Depot, 63,000 acres of bunkers held 400,000 tons of explosives. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy, at its 1941 peak, had only half that in total reserve. And in Nebraska, Hastings thrummed like a living organism. Workers ate in cafeterias serving 15,000 meals daily, watched Friday night movies, and sent children to depot schools. It was a city built for one purpose: to make the sky burn. Across the Pacific, 12-year-old Akiko Sato worked 12-hour shifts at Toyokawa, filling shell casings. "We were always hungry," she wrote later. "They gave us one rice ball for lunch. We worked until we collapsed." Her section produced perhaps 100 shells a day, less than an American destroyer fired in a minute of combat. When the Imperial Navy tried to replace lost stockpiles, submarines destroyed the convoys carrying ammunition. By 1944, more than half of all Japanese ammunition shipments were sunk en route. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton's USS Wahoo destroyed one such ship, Fukai Maru. The blast was visible 40 miles away. That single ship carried more ammunition than the Rabaul garrison would see in 3 months. Japan was bleeding shells faster than it could forge them. As the year ended, the ammunition war reached into every aspect of life. Copper shortages forced the collection of temple bells, bronze statues, even household pots. Between 1937 and 1945, Japan melted 45,000 Buddhist temple bells, 90% of the nation's total. Each yielded enough metal for roughly 2,000 small shell casings. An American destroyer could expend that in 16 minutes. The Pacific had become a machine that measured time in rounds per minute and fate in production quotas. Next would come the final tragic logic of that imbalance, the moment when Japan, unable to produce enough ammunition, turned its pilots into the weapons themselves. Chapter 4. When ammunition ran out by 1945, Japan was fighting ghosts. The Imperial Navy still sailed, but its magazines were half empty, its flight schools starved of bullets and fuel, and its factories filled with children instead of craftsmen. The nation had entered the final, tragic stage of arithmetic defeat. April 6, 1945. Operation Tengo, the sortie of Yamato. The world's largest battleship left the inland sea on what all aboard understood was a one-way mission. She carried 170 rounds for her 9 18.1-inch guns, 130 per barrel, a full main battery load. Her 6.1-inch guns had 1,629 rounds. Her anti-aircraft magazines held 13,500 rounds, enough for roughly 12 minutes of sustained fire. Captain Kosaku Aruga addressed his men bluntly. "We sail with enough ammunition for one battle. There will be no resupply. Use every round wisely." The next day, April 7th, 386 American aircraft found her. The first waves reported tremendous AA fire. By the third, the sky's thunder dimmed. By the fifth, Yamato's anti-aircraft fire was sporadic. Ensign Mitsuru Yoshida, one of the few survivors, later recalled, "The 25mm guns fell silent first, no ammunition. Then the 127mm guns. Finally, even the main battery had nothing left. We were a 70,000-ton target, nothing more. When Yamato capsized, it was not merely a battleship sinking. It was Japan's last full ammunition locker sliding beneath the waves. The American task forces that destroyed her had been replenished just 72 hours earlier. USS Essex alone had received 500 tons of ammunition, roughly 400,000 rounds of varying calibers. Her air group would expend 200,000 rounds of 50 caliber bullets that day, knowing that the next convoy would restock them before sunset. The contrast between those two ships, Yamato, empty after 12 minutes, and Essex, refilled every 3 days, was the Pacific War in miniature. By late 1944, copper shortages had already driven Japan to melt its heritage for war. Bells that had rung across the islands for centuries were lowered and smashed. Bronze statues disappeared. Entire communities lined up to surrender household pots and door handles. 45,000 temple bells vanished into smelters between 1937 and 1945. Each yielded enough brass for about 2,000 shell casings, the output of an American destroyer in a brief firefight. 13-year-old Yukio Tanaka wrote in her diary, "They took our school bell today for ammunition." Teacher Yamamoto cried. "He said it had rung for 200 years. How many shells will it make? How many seconds will those shells last in battle?" The answer, 16 minutes of a single 40mm mount, was too cruel to speak. Inside the Toyokawa Naval Arsenal, reality was harsher still. Accidents claimed 15% of the workforce every month. Explosions and poison gas leaks became routine. When a B-29 raid struck the facility on August 7, 1945, it killed 2,477 workers, most of them teenagers. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American worker Mary Roberts assembled shells at Hastings. "We worked 8-hour shifts 5 days a week," she remembered. "Good pay, $1.20 an hour. Hot meals in the cafeteria, movies every Friday. We knew we were winning the war, one shell at a time." Her words were the quiet mirror to Aruga's farewell. One woman, building shells in comfort. One captain, spending them in despair. The American war machine was not only vast, it was flexible. Its logistics squadrons became mobile cities. Service Squadron 10, the Navy's floating supply arm, included 34 fleet oilers, 19 ammunition ships, 16 refrigerated stores ships, and a small navy of destroyer escorts. On July 21, 22, 1945, Task Group 30.8 conducted the largest single at-sea replenishment in history. 369 tons of ammunition, 157 barrels of fuel oil, 1,235 tons of provisions, 99 aircraft, 421 personnel, all transferred in less than 2 days. That one resupply operation delivered more ammunition than most Japanese naval bases possessed in total. After the war, Admiral Soemu Toyoda admitted the truth. "We calculated American consumption based on our own limitations. If we could afford 1,000 rounds, we assumed they might have 3,000. The reality, that they had 100,000, was beyond imagination." The shortage didn't just affect battle, it destroyed training. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest surviving ace, summarized it coldly. "In 1941, we had 700 hours of flight training. In 1944, new pilots had 40 to 60. Gunnery practice, perhaps 100 rounds. American trainees at Pensacola fired 5,000 rounds before earning their wings. For them, poor marksmanship meant more practice. For Japanese cadets, poor marksmanship meant silence, no ammunition left to correct it. Ensign Koshiro Ito, trained in 1944, remembered, "I fired my guns exactly 3 times before combat. 10 rounds each time, 30 rounds total. My first mission, the American I faced probably fired 30 rounds in the first second." Even for anti-aircraft gunners, doctrine turned into desperation. Japanese officers ordered crews to hold fire until aircraft closed within 800 meters, point blank against planes moving 300 miles per hour, because every round mattered. American gunners did the opposite. Seaman First Class Robert Scott, a 20mm gunner aboard USS New Jersey, laughed when asked about ammunition discipline. "We fired at everything: sleeves, balloons, floating barrels. I must have shot 50,000 rounds in training. When a real plane came, my hands just knew what to do." As American confidence swelled, Japanese tactics shrank. Admiral Willis Ching Lee's doctrine of area saturation turned night battles into acts of mathematical extermination. At Surigao Strait, October 25, 1944, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line fired 285 16-inch shells, over 3,000 14-inch, and thousands more of lighter calibers in just 18 minutes. The Japanese battleships Fuzo and Yamashiro, sailing with reduced loads to conserve weight, returned fewer than 100 shells before being obliterated. Lieutenant Commander Tokuno Horesi, one of Yamashiro's few survivors, recalled, "Shells fell like rain. We fired back, but for every shell we sent, 50 came back." And when even shells became too precious, the weapon became the pilot himself. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, creator of the Kamikaze Corps, admitted privately, "We resort to body crashing because we lack the ammunition for conventional attack. One pilot, one plane replaces hundreds of shells we don't have." In those words, Japan's industrial collapse became spiritual. Faith replacing firepower, sacrifice replacing shell fire. The American codebreakers, reading intercepted messages, saw the pattern clearly. In December 1944, a decrypted report listed combined fleet ammunition status: 16-inch, 15% of required minimum; 14-inch, 22%; 8-inch, 18%; 5-inch, 31%. Anti-aircraft. Critical shortage, all calibers. Admiral Chester Nimitz read the summary and told his staff, "They're a boxer with no punch left. We just keep hitting until they fall." In the months that followed, that prediction would come true, punctuated not by strategy, but by silence. Japanese ships sank without firing back. Pilots died with guns unfired. Ammunition, the blood of war, had simply run out. Chapter 5. The Arithmetic of Defeat. By August 1945, Japan's empire had collapsed not through one decisive blow, but through a steady draining of its material soul. What had begun as a naval contest between warriors had turned into a competition between factories, and Japan's factories had lost. The last months of the war exposed the mathematics of extinction in its purest form. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, turning Japan's ocean supply routes into graveyards. Of the ammunition ships Japan sent to sea, 147 were sunk, 500,000 tons of munitions erased beneath the waves. That was 55% of all ammunition shipments attempted. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, described one such sinking. The Fukukai Maru, hit in January 1943, erupted with such ferocity that the explosion was seen 40 miles away. She had carried more shells than the entire Rabaul garrison would receive in 3 months. Japanese convoys began to move not as arteries of supply, but as funeral processions. Captain Tatsuaka Shimazaki, who commanded one of these doomed convoys, wrote bitterly in his journal, "We loaded at Kure with 10,000 tons of shells for Rabaul. 4 ships. By the time we arrived, 2 were sunk, 1 crippled. We delivered 2,000 tons. The submarines took the rest." In Manila, Commander Yoshiro Tanaka, responsible for distributing ammunition to frontline units, saw the hopelessness firsthand. When an entire shipment was lost to submarines, he took his own life, leaving a note that read, "I send empty ships to die. Our guns fall silent while theirs never stop." Those silences echoed everywhere. American cryptanalyst Commander Joseph Rochefort explained it simply. "We could predict Japanese operations by their ammunition requisitions. When they asked for resupply, we knew they couldn't fight for at least 2 weeks. We owned the timing of every battle. By 1945, the disparity had become cosmic. The United States produced 47 billion rounds of small arms ammunition between 1941 and 1945, 41 billion of them rifle and pistol rounds. In a single month, American factories could turn out more munitions than Japan had produced during the entire war. The ratio of output was roughly 3 to 100 to 1, yet the imbalance wasn't just in quantity, it was in reliability. American proximity fuses, miniature radar-guided triggers developed at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, multiplied anti-aircraft lethality by up to 600%. The development had cost $1 billion wartime dollars, 5% of Japan's total 1944 GDP, and required precision manufacturing beyond Japan's reach. By war's end, the US had produced 22 million of them. When Japanese officers first witnessed their effect, they were convinced they were facing sorcery. Admiral Koshi Hagawa, watching an American barrage in 1945, wrote, "The enemy's shells explode by magic, knowing when they approach our aircraft. Each detonation is perfectly placed. This is not warfare. It is witchcraft by mathematics." In truth, it was neither magic nor witchcraft. It was industry, electricity, and measurement. The same arithmetic ruled gunnery. American destroyers relied on the Mark 37 gunfire control system, a marvel of gyroscopic stabilization, radar tracking, and mechanical computation. The system could track targets and adjust for ship roll in real time. Cost per unit, $500,000, more than the entire annual ammunition budget for a Japanese destroyer squadron. Captain Toshiro Miura summarized the difference. "We aimed by eye while they aimed by machine. We guessed while they calculated." The results could be measured in survival. USS Laffey, the ship that would not die, survived 22 kamikaze attacks on April 16, 1945, because her gunners never stopped firing. 345 rounds of 5-inch, 11,000 rounds of 40 mm, and 20,000 rounds of 20 meters in 80 minutes. 9 aircraft shot down, 4 more crippled before impact. Her opposite number, the Japanese destroyer Yahagi, escorting Yamato, ran out of anti-aircraft ammunition after 45 minutes and could only maneuver helplessly as the sky fell. 7 torpedo hits, 12 bombs, 1 ship gone. This was the arithmetic of firepower, survival as a function of production. The same numbers defined the lives of individuals. Ensign Teo Matsui, manning a 25mm gun on the carrier Zuikaku during its final battle, received 10 rounds for his weapon. He held fire through repeated American attacks, waiting for the perfect shot that never came. Zuikaku sank with his unfired rounds. His mother later received his last letter. "I have 10 chances to protect our ship. I will make each one count." She never learned he died without firing once. Meanwhile, on the USS Essex, Seaman Robert Dixon fired 15,000 rounds from his 20mm gun during the same battle. "It was like a fireworks show that never ends." He wrote home, "We've got so much ammunition, nothing can get through." The difference between them was not bravery, but arithmetic. By war's end, the final reports told a truth too vast for emotion. United States naval ammunition production, 1941-1945. Total rounds, all types, 47 billion. Total weight, 4.2 million tons. Peak monthly output, 3.5 billion rounds. Factories, 47. Peak employment, 486,000 workers. Japanese naval ammunition production, 1941-1945. Total rounds, approximately 15 million. Total weight, 200,000 tons. Factories, 11. Peak employment, 95,000, including thousands of children. The gulf between them, 3 to 100 to 1, was not just an industrial statistic. It was a measure of civilization itself. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Japan's final naval commander, said it plainly. "We could build ships without steel. We could fly planes without fuel, but we could not fight without ammunition. The Americans had infinite amounts. We had whatever we could salvage from our grandfathers' temples." When Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15, 1945, he spoke of a new and most cruel bomb. But Japan's leaders knew the atomic bomb was only the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence already written in brass. At Kura Naval Arsenal, workers were still filling shells on August 14th, the day before the announcement. The production report for that day read, "Daily output, 73 shells, various calibers. Worker strength, 423, including 200 middle school students. Status, critical shortage, all materials." At the same hour, Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot reported, "Daily output, 45,000 shells, various calibers. Worker strength, 5 to 800. Status, exceeding quota. Recommendation, reduce production due to anticipated war termination." 2 worlds, 1 ending. Captain Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the entire war, captured it best in his memoir. "We brought swords to a machine gun fight, then wondered why we lost. The Americans did not defeat our Navy. Their factories did." The floor of the Pacific still bears the record. Millions of brass casings stamped with American ordnance marks, each one the fossil of industrial supremacy. The Americans fired without thinking because they could afford to. The Japanese counted every round because they had to. Between those two realities lay the abyss that swallowed an empire. Wars, Hara wrote, are not won by courage, but by capacity. And in the Pacific, capacity had been limitless.